Now, another new face, Mr. Caskey.
Good afternoon, my Lord. I appeal this afternoon and will be leading two witnesses. My Lord has already granted a restriction order in relation to the identity of the first witness and her father, who will be the subject of much of the evidence. But at this stage, I would simply ask the first witness to be brought in.
Very good, thank you. Now again, do we have someone to do that?
Paul.
Could you please? Thank you. I'm grateful. Now, good afternoon. Please come in and take a seat.
Afternoon, Lord Brailsford.
Thank you. Now, Mr. Caskey, when you're ready.
Thank you. I've already identified to Lord Brailsford that you've obtained a restriction order in relation to your own name and that of your father, but it is predominantly your father we'll be talking about. What I'd like to do to begin is to ask you to identify or to give us some information about your dad before he became ill.
Okay. My dad was a strong, energetic and dynamic person. He didn't get a great education, but he was a clever man who was ambitious and wasn't afraid of hard work. He had his own business for most of his working life. He was creative. He could turn his hand to any kind of DIY task. He loved nature, being outdoors, and he loved his garden. He was a charming, sociable man who loved outings, tea dances, choirs, and he was respected and very much loved by his family.
Thank you very much. Your father was born on the 28th of September 1933
That's right.
and sadly passed away on the 6th of September 2021.
Yes.
And his cause of death was recorded as COVID.
Yes.
I understand that 12 years before his death, he was diagnosed with dementia.
Yes.
But that was initially managed at home.
His dementia progressed very slowly, and with the medication that he was prescribed and support at home, we managed perfectly fine.
And in the initial stages, who provided the support at home?
His family.
And was your mother in a position to do that then?
She was, yes, although my mum had physical problems, but mentally she was fine, so they both worked well together.
And I think it's correct that sadly your mother passed away in March 2018.
Yes.
At that point, did you take a power of attorney in relation to your father?
Yes, I did.
And did he continue to live in what had been the family home?
Yes. We were able to, with the help of a band of carers, look after my dad after my mum passed away. Myself and my siblings and the carers, someone always slept over and was with him all the time. So we managed to do that for 15 months or so until we were kind of forced to change.
And did that happen around June 2019? And what was the change?
There was an incident where my dad had shown some aggression towards one of the lady carers who was on her own with my dad in the house. And that we were concerned that we had a duty of care to the carers for their well-being, and it was at that point that we felt it was time to look at a care home for my dad.
Okay. Now, I understand that between then and your father's death, he had been in 3 care homes or institutions. Is that correct?
That's right.
I'll refer to each of the care homes by the sequence in which he was in them. So care home 1, care home 2, care home 3.
Okay.
Okay. and I think it's correct that he went into Care Home 1 in June 19.
Yes.
Tell me about the selection process for the care home.
So, as my mum and dad both started to need more help, a care manager became involved with the family in 2017, and a care package was put in place for both my mum and my dad. And through discussions with the care worker, we realised that it was more than likely that my mum would predecease my dad because of her health, and that there would be a point in the future that my dad probably would need to go into a care home. So in advance of that, the care worker recommended that we start looking around, go visit a few care homes, which my brother and sister and I did. And we went to many care homes, and the ones that we liked the best were the local authority care homes. And the one in particular that my dad ended up in was the one we liked best.
And we're going to refer to that as Care Home 1?
Yes, Care Home 1.
Now, whilst your father was in Care Home 1, can you tell me about visits that you and other family members would make?
We were allowed pretty much unrestricted access to the care home, other than trying to avoid meal times. But we could pop in just about any time, and that included evenings. Often I'd finish work and pop up at 8 o'clock and have an hour with him with a cup of tea, or go in his room and watch TV. And that was always welcomed. I was able to go in and help my dad with personal care, shower him if he needed it, shave him. So it really was like his home, in as much as our family and his friends could come and go as we wished.
And how frequently would you go in?
4 or 5 times a week.
And were there other family members visiting at that time as well?
Brother, my sister, my dad's had 3 sisters, friends. He went out to a tea dance a couple of times a week and other activities. So he had a very busy life.
In terms of his, what one might call ordinary medical needs, the things that everyone needs, access to a dentist, a podiatrist, and so on. And I understand he also had diabetes, so diabetes screening. How was that dealt with?
I took him to all the appointments he needed to go to, whether it was the dentist or the screenings or podiatrist.
Now, during the period that he was in Care Home 1, what developments were there in his dementia?
Again, he settled quickly into the care home, and it progressed slowly. He started to show a little bit more aggressive behaviours, a bit more challenging behaviours over the period of time he was in there. But in the main, it wasn't progressing hugely, I didn't feel.
And was a decision made during the period that he was in that care home that it would be appropriate to carry out further work with him, an assessment or?
Well, the care home approached us in March of 2020 to say that they felt that they could no longer meet his needs. This is the phrase that they use when they found his behaviours too challenging for them. They were a residential care home, not an EMI unit.
What's EMI?
Elderly, mentally infirm. And that means that the staff have additional training to cope with more challenging dementia behaviours. So they didn't have the staff trained in that way, and therefore felt they couldn't meet his needs, and so they asked that we agree to him going to the next facility to be assessed with a view to his medications being tweaked to help better manage his behaviours. Okay. And they assured us that if that happened and things settled, that they could look at him coming back to Care Home 1.
Okay, now we're going to talk about Care Home 3 in a few moments, but was there a distinct difference between Care Home 1, Care Home 3 and Care Home 2? Was Care Home 2 different?
Very, very different.
In what way?
Not homely, I thought very stark, bleak, unstimulating, I didn't like it at all.
Who ran Care Home 2?
That was an NHS facility.
Right. And was the function of that facility to take people in the long term?
I don't think long term, as I understand it, typically people like my dad would have gone in there for 6 to 8 weeks to be assessed, their medication to be tweaked, amended, with a view to things settling down and then him moving on.
To either the first care home or a third care home?
Yes.
I understand that he moved to a third care home. Why didn't he move back to Care Home 1?
Care Home 1 weren't prepared to take him back after the 8 or 9 weeks that he had spent in Care Home 2. Once they decided things were more settled and he could leave there, Care Home 1 said they didn't feel they could best meet his needs, so weren't prepared to take him back. So we were left in the position of having to find somewhere else for my dad.
Okay, I'll ask you about finding Care Home 3 in a moment, but before I do that, can I ask you how these events, your dad going into Care Home 2, coincided with COVID lockdowns?
I believe it was March the 11th, or was it March the 8th? It was 3 days before the NHS lockdown, and that was before the general lockdown. So I had taken him up to Care Home 2. We had to agree to him being sectioned under the Mental Health Act, and I left him there that day. I saw him the next day, and when I'd gone back, I think on day 4, it was at that point that I was told I couldn't come in, the ward was locked, and that the NHS had decided to lock down all their facilities at that point.
And how did you find out that the ward had gone into lockdown?
Just when I arrived, I'd come up with some of my dad's clothes and was told, can't come in.
And how long was your dad in Care Home 2?
8 or 9 weeks.
Right, and I think you said earlier, in general, people would be in for about 6 or slightly more.
That's what we were told at the outset.
But for your dad, it took 8 or 9 weeks.
Yes.
And did you see your dad during the 8 or 9 weeks that he was in Care Home 2?
No.
So you had been visiting 4 or 5 times a week. You'd had other visitors. Did anyone else get into Care Home 2 to visit him?
No.
No. At the end of that 8 or 9 week period, you said that you wanted, or you had to find another place for him to go. Can you tell me about the selection process?
So I contacted 1 or 2 care homes that we'd previously seen and that we thought were okay, but they weren't prepared to take him. After discussing my dad with the medical people at Care Home 2, they came back to me and said they didn't feel that they could meet his needs. So the social carer, the social worker, she was able to find a place in another care home, one that we hadn't seen and that we weren't familiar with, but we didn't have many options at that point.
Okay. The 8 or 9 week period that he was in Care Home 2, what impact did that have on, firstly, on him, so far as you're aware?
Well, when I did eventually see him, when the window visiting began, I was quite shocked at his decline. He'd gone in a very physically fit man who was still quite animated and lively, and when I saw him, he'd changed hugely. Physically much slower, and mentally much poorer.
But you had managed to find Care Home 3?
With the help of the care manager, she had let us know about the care homes that did have spaces. We had a video tour of the care home prior to agreeing that he would go and live there, and it looked okay. I looked at some of the Care Commission reports on the home and it looked okay, so we had to go with it.
Did you consider the possibility of him coming to live with you at that time?
I did, and that's something that I'd, over the years, as I knew my dad's dementia was progressing, I always felt that that would be where he would end up, with me. However, my husband was diagnosed with cancer at the end of 2019, so he was undergoing treatment in March of 2020 when all this was going on, and I didn't feel that I could cope with all of that was going on. Plus, the care managers, everybody was saying to me, it's too difficult, it's too much, you don't know what you're taking on. So it was something I wrestled with and still feel somewhat guilty about now.
I'm sure there's no reason to feel guilt. When your dad is moving to Care Home 3, did you consider that was likely to be a place that he would be in the long term?
I thought it would be, yes.
And as a result of that, did you take the normal personal items that one retains to the care home?
We took, yes, his clothes and, yes, his personal things, pictures and so on. We took them up and had to leave them at the care home door, obviously.
Mm-hmm. When he initially arrived in Care Home 3, how was his physical health?
They told me that he was settled, and that's how he was able to leave Care Home 2. But within a few days of him arriving in Care Home 3, he had a fall, and there was a query over whether it was COVID that he had or suspected possibly a chest infection. And so his GP saw him and recommended that he go to hospital.
Were there any other health issues at that time that resulted in him being referred to hospital?
Not that I'm aware of.
Did he have a chest infection?
That was he'd fallen, and the query was it COVID or was it a chest infection?
Okay. In terms of the transfer to the hospital, can you tell me about the communication you got from Care Home 3 to say he was going to hospital?
So I think they reported to me that the GP had seen him and that they'd recommend he go into hospital. So I believe an ambulance took him to hospital. But the hospital felt that they couldn't treat him and that he was best. It would be better for him to be returned to the care home.
And in terms of, how long was he in the hospital?
I believe it was 2 days.
And when he went back to the care home, did it require ongoing high-level medical treatment or not?
No, I think he might have had antibiotics, but it was a requirement that he be isolated. Despite having a negative COVID test in the hospital, when he came back to the care home, it was a requirement that he be isolated in his room for another 14 days.
And how was your dad, do you think, in relation to isolation?
Well, the dad that I had known would have found that very difficult because physically he was very fit and liked to walk about. So I think they would find that difficult to keep him in his room.
Mm-hmm. Were any attempts made to facilitate communication? Did he have a telephone in his room?
No.
Were you able to phone the care home?
I was able to phone the care home and got updates at any time that I wanted them. After he arrived in the care home, one of the carers got their iPad and made a Zoom call with us so that I was able to see him for the first time in many weeks on the Zoom call. But he seemed a bit confused about where my voice was coming from, and it wasn't really satisfactory.
And did you have any more Zoom calls after that?
No.
So one attempt and it didn't work?
Yeah.
Okay. Now, you had mentioned that when he was in Care Home 1, in terms of his ordinary care, dentist, podiatrist, dietitian screening and so on, that you would be the one that would take him to have those things carried out. Did that continue when he was in Care Home 3?
Well, none of that could continue because I wasn't able to see him, to get into him. I was aware at one point that his toenails had needed some attention, so I think all that seemed to fall away during the confusion of lockdown and all that was going on at the time.
I think in the statement, paragraph 48, you make reference to your father having dentures.
Yes.
Were there problems with that?
They appeared to be mislaid, so for a number of weeks. It was a partial denture, so he was missing his dentures for a few weeks, and it took a few weeks before the community dental team were able to come into the care home to fit him for a new denture.
For the record, that was paragraph 50.
Thank you.
48.
Sorry. Thank you, Bob.
Just for the record.
When you said that you were able to phone and get updates from the staff at the care home. Did you feel they had time to do that?
Yes, I never had any problem in speaking to it was usually the nurse that was on duty that I would talk to, the nurse in his wing, and she wasn't always available when I phoned, but she always called me back at some point.
Mm. And I think the next significant event that happened in terms of contact between yourself and your father was the introduction of window visits. Can you tell me about your experience of window visits?
Well, it was great to actually see him in the flesh. That's the first thing to say. After so many weeks apart, he was in a lounge behind a closed window, and I think my brother and sister had gone along, were outside with masks on, just able to shout through the window, make some hand gestures. But my dad's hearing wasn't great, so whilst it was great to see him, there wasn't a lot of communication.
And how often would window visits happen?
We were restricted because there were so many residents in the care home. I want to say maybe once a fortnight. I honestly can't remember.
And did you attempt to get the frequency of contact increased?
Always.
Uh-huh.
Always, because, as I said, I'm one of 3 children. We all wanted to see our dad. His sisters wanted to see him, his friends, so we had to share out the visits so that everyone got a chance to see him.
But you weren't allowed to see him en masse, or?
No. I think the 2 was the limit.
And was there anyone, were the care home providing you with information about visits and what limits there were and what the conditions and criteria were?
The manager of the care home was the one who was updating us as things changed. I was quite proactive, and it was usually me that was emailing her or calling her to ask when the next stage in visiting would start. As things slowly started to change, I was pushing for those changes quicker than they happened. And
was there anyone outside the care home who was providing you with advice or information?
Well, I joined the Care Home Relative Scotland group, and they were a great resource for me of information and support. I knew of other people who had relatives in care homes, and so anecdotally I was getting information from them too about what was happening in their relatives' care home.
And were you able to use that information in your discussion with Care Home 3?
Yes, I was. I was pushing them all the time to go faster, to implement the changes quicker.
Now, I understand that Care Home 3 was part of a larger group of care homes. Again, don't mention the name, but did that have a management structure which extended outside the care home?
Yes. So it seemed that all the changes were cascaded down from their head office. So the manager would often say to me that she couldn't do anything until she had had instruction and guidance from her head office.
And when instruction or guidance was issued, was that always followed by the care home?
I'm not aware of it not being followed. I think it was followed, although I became aware that garden visits had started in other care homes in the area, and Care Home 3 hadn't yet started it there, so I wanted to know why and was pushing for it to begin as soon
And what were you being told? Were you being told that was an internal decision within the care home, or within the organisation?
Yes, that they hadn't yet had permission from their head office to go ahead with that.
Right. Did you think that the communication between Care Home 3 and their management outside the care home was joined up?
I can't say if it was or not. I don't know, Mr. Caskey.
The next thing which they started, I think, was window visits at Care Home 3.
Garden visits.
Sorry, garden visits. Tell me about the garden visits.
So they took place in the extensive gardens at the care home with they put up one of these sort of pergola things. Chairs were put around maybe 3 metres apart, and initially a carer would bring my dad down, sit beside him, and we would see him and shout across to him, and it was good to see him in the flesh.
Was there any privacy?
No privacy. And I became aware that there had been a complaint about why was it necessary for a carer to sit beside our loved one, and that subsequently changed.
How long did the visits last?
They lasted a half an hour.
In a garden?
Yes.
And was he always appropriately dressed to sit in the garden for half an hour?
No, there was one occasion when I arrived for my 4 p.m. visit, was waiting in the garden, and Dad wasn't brought down until 4:10, which I wasn't unhappy about because that was taking away 10 valuable minutes of my time with him. But when he was brought down, he didn't have a coat on, and so within a very few minutes of him sitting outside, it was clear that he wasn't comfortable. It was chilly, he was cold, and so I raised that with the management about A, why was he brought down late, and B, it wasn't acceptable that there was no consideration given to his clothing and making sure that he was comfortable.
When you were giving your earlier answer, I think you said that he was brought down 10 minutes late, and I was happy about that.
Right, unhappy.
Unhappy. Sorry, my fault. How important were those visits for you?
Very, very important.
Was there anyone else in the family visiting at the same time?
My brother, my sister, say my dad's sisters, who would usually bring along someone.
And how important to them were the visits?
Very, very important.
And how important do you think they were to your dad?
Well, I think they must have been very important to him, because having not seen us for so many weeks, I can only contemplate what he must have felt when all contact with his family, his activities, his social life, all abruptly stopped. He ended up in an unfamiliar, unstimulating place, Care Home 2. He wouldn't have understood what was going on. All he would know was, where was his family? Why had he apparently been abandoned? So to see us again must have been great for him too, because he still knew us. He still knew us all.
After a period of garden visits, there were indoor visits. How frequently did they happen
Again,
once they started?
I think, again, they were maybe once a fortnight, again for half an hour. They made a lounge available on the ground floor that could be accessed from the outside. It had an external door. And again, Dad was brought down and left in the room with me, appropriately dressed in PPE.
You?
Yeah.
Not your dad?
No, me.
Right. At those visits, were you able to give him gifts or things that he enjoyed?
I would bring him some fruit, which he always liked, but nothing else, because they made clear that anything, for example, a birthday present, would have to be given a few days early so they could quarantine it for, I think it was 48 hours, to make sure that it wasn't infectious.
You mentioned fruit. Was there a particular fruit that was your dad's favourite?
He liked bananas a lot.
Did he? Did no one think of peeling the banana in front of him and giving him the banana?
Well, we tried to give him a banana on one occasion in a garden visit, and the carer took it from us and said, you know, we couldn't give it to him, but worried about passing COVID on to him. So.
And that was at the time of garden visits?
That was when they were supervised.
Right.
Yep.
Right. Were some of the rules just petty in your view?
They seemed to be, to me.
In terms of your interaction with the care home, did you contact anyone outside the care home about what the situation was there?
I was speaking to the care manager to try to get guidance and help from her. At times, I think I was referred to the public health team at one point when there was word of that I'd be able to take my dad out in the car, and I was advised that there had to be a risk assessment done, and the care home had said that I needed to speak to public health about that, about this risk assessment. And when I spoke to them, they said no, it was nothing to do with them, and that I should go back to the care home because it was their responsibility to do a risk assessment. So it was all rather confused. No one seemed to know.
And was that your impression generally?
Yes.
Not just about that aspect, but just in general?
Conflicting messages, confusion, yeah.
And why do you think that the care homes were reticent to let you do the things that you believed from reading the guidance that you were entitled to do?
Well, everybody, there was this great drive to protect people in care homes. We, families, I think, were seen as the route by which the virus would be brought into the care home, so we were to be kept out at all costs because we were the risk. I don't agree with that, but that was the overriding feeling at the time. And
you say you don't agree with the family being the risk. Tell me why you've reached that conclusion.
Well, I was living a very, very sheltered, quiet life during all of lockdown because my husband was undergoing treatment for cancer, so he was compromised. You know, I'm sure that there were many of the care home staff were living more risky lives, if you want to call it that, in terms of picking up the virus than I was. So I felt strongly that I wasn't a risk and that I should be allowed to come in and continue to care for my dad in the way I had been.
And the restrictions that were imposed upon you by the care home and by the government, do you regard those as proportionate?
No.
Tell me why.
Just as I say, because I felt it was unfair. I felt it was cruel that the value that people like me and other families brought to our loved ones and to the care homes wasn't appreciated. Instead, we were seen as the enemy. We had a lot of. We could have helped in a huge way to look after our loved ones and to help protect their health, both physically and mentally. And I just felt it was cruel to take away the contacts, the family members from our loved ones who are in the last years of their lives. And I feel bitter that the last 18 months of my dad's life were impacted because we weren't able to spend time with him in the way that we should have.
Take a breath. I understand that your father's health then started to decline.
Yes. As I say, there was a big change in him after he moved to Care Home 3. I think in part due to the fact that all of his stimulation had ceased, all of the activities that he was taking part in, the outings that would have helped his physical health, the stimulation to help his mental health. When that all stopped, I'm sure that contributed to the dementia progressing more quickly.
Okay.
And he had changed markedly.
Now, I just want to clear one thing up. Towards the very end of your father's life, what happened to the visits then?
When the care home told me, I think we became aware that COVID was circulating again in his care home, and they were doing tests, and they told me that my father had tested positive for COVID, and within a day or two it was clear that it was serious, and he was confined to his bed, and he was poorly, and at that point my sister and brother and I were told we could come and see him at any time for as long as we wanted. We were able to get into his room via a fire escape because his room was at the end of a corridor, so there was no need for us to go through the care home. So we were able to come up a back stair and go directly into his room. Now,
you mentioned earlier that you had received information and support from Care Home Relatives Scotland. And you will know that one of the things that they have spoken about is Anne's Law.
Yes.
Tell me what difference you think Anne's Law would make.
I think it would make a huge difference. I know if I had been that designated individual that could continue to support my dad in the care home, I believe it would have made a huge difference. He wouldn't have felt abandoned. We could have continued our contacts. I would have been able to carry on the oversight that I had with my dad to make sure that he was well and being looked after, that everything was being done for him. And for me too, the pain of that separation, I wouldn't have had that.
Okay. I understand from the witness statement that you had the family, including your dad, had put in place an anticipatory care plan.
Yes.
And that came to its conclusion on the 6th of September 2021 when your father passed away.
Yes.
Were there any restrictions on the funeral?
No.
I think those are all the questions I have for you. Apart from one, do you feel as though you've had the opportunity to say the things you need to?
I do. Other than to say that if my dad had been able to, had he been asked a question and been able to answer it about what he would have wanted, would he have wanted to be sequestrated away, protected at all costs if that meant no family contacts? I know he would have said no. He would have wanted to continue to see his family, even if that meant there was a risk to him of picking up the virus. I know that for sure.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'm very grateful for your attendance.
Thank you, my lord.
Good. Now, Mr. Caskey, it's 20 to 3. Is it possible to have your next witness earlier than anticipated? Is she here?
Yes, she's here and I think ready to go. If we just have 10 minutes.
I was going to say, shall we give the stenographer 10 minutes now?
Yes.
And that would mean coming back at 10 to 3. Very good.
Thank you.
Grateful. Thank you. No.
Good afternoon again,
Good
sir.
afternoon, Mr. Caskey. On you go.
The next witness is Tracey and McMillan.
Right. Now, Miss McMillan, good afternoon. In you come and sit down, make yourself comfortable. Now, when you're ready, Mr. Caskey.
Ms McMillan, you've provided a witness statement for the assistance of the inquiry. Is the content of that true?
Yes.
And do you want Lord Brailsford to take that into account when you're giving evidence?
Yes, please.
There is a restriction order in place in relation to mentioning other members of your family, including your mother, so you shouldn't mention their names in relation to any of this. And I also see from the witness statement that you have a professional role in health and social care.
That's right.
I understand you want to say something about the evidence that you're about to give.
Yes, I think the evidence that I'll be giving today will be from the perspective of a daughter, of having a loved one in the care home at that time, not referring to my, not as a professional. I want to be very clear about that.
Very fair.
From the statement, I see that your mother was born on the 3rd of March 1948 and sadly passed away on the 25th of April 2021. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Where did she live her life?
In East Ayrshire, in a small village, Ochiltree. My mum was very much part of the community there. She was a very community person, a real people person. She would welcome any new people to the village, make sure they knew what was happening. My mum was connected with the Girls' Brigade and the Old Folks Committee. So I suppose she really was an integrated part of the village, and she really just moved from the village into a smaller town in East Ayrshire really after my dad died and her diabetes worsened and her eyesight worsened, so that's really when she moved there.
Before she moved into the other village,
Yeah.
Would you describe her as a stalwart of the community?
Yes, and I think really when she died, the community were keen to recognise that, and there's now a bench in the village with her name on it, so people are aware of, I suppose, the input that she had within the village.
Okay. You said that when her husband died, she decided to downsize, is that correct?
That's right.
And that would be in 2012?
Yes.
Is that right?
My dad died in 1997, and I suppose she'd kind of struggled on in the house, and at the point when my dad died, I suppose that's when her diabetes began to worsen and her eyesight worsened and her mobility. So I suppose that kind of combination, that's when she then moved on to Cumnock.
Tell me about her eyesight worsening.
So my mum was diagnosed with diabetes, I think, in about 1976, and that was managed by diet. But then really when my dad died, my mum was widowed, she really struggled with that, and she was really quite low in mood, and I think her eating was impacted, and then from there her diabetes management was really quite poor, and she had to move on to that being managed by medication and latterly insulin, and I suppose her eyesight worsening was really a part of her diabetes. So my mum latterly, when she lived in Cumnock, was registered blind, but in spite of her blindness, my mum, she was quite feisty, quite resourceful, but still very much a member of the community. So when she was in Cumnock, she was a member of the Cumnock Blind Club, and she actually used to go on road tested activities.
What do you mean road tests?
So in terms of, I suppose, almost using her disability to an advantage. So she'd plan, when they were planning ahead for activities, her and her friend would go in advance, months in advance, and go out and find out how disability and blind friendly a cafe or a local community place was it somewhere in terms of where they'd got adequate space, was there distinction in terms of so it would be a safe place for other people who are blind to go and visit. So
she was road testing it?
Yes.
Okay, I understand that better now. I understand that the diabetes also had another major impact on her around 2017.
Yes, so that's when my mum initially had a sore in her toe, which led to hospital admission. But the sore just really spread, and then that led to a below knee amputation. And with that from hospital, she moved to receive rehab, and then the local community hospital. And with the combination with the difficulty with her eyesight, and then with a below knee amputation, which impacted on her mobility, that's when we, as a family, and my mum and her brother, we felt that how safe we should really be at home. And I suppose the really difficult decision about her moving into a care home setting. So it was with great reluctance she moved in the December of 2017. She moved into a local care home in Cumnock then. That initially was really difficult for my mum because prior to then she had her own house, her own independence, she could come and go as she pleased. But I think over time and over the initial months she was there, they got to know my mum and got to know what was important to her. And the community was really important to her, being part of her community, being known in that community, and maintaining friendships and relationships in that community. Also, I suppose, fresh air was really important to her, and getting out and about, actually socialising. So I think when they realised in terms of for maintaining my mum's mood, it was really important that she could maintain those things. So with a wheelchair taxi, she could get out and about and have a cup of tea with her friends. She could get out and about and go to the local shopping centre and then come back with that wraparound care of an evening, because she would require 2 carers to transfer her and to kind of meet her needs and keep her safe. So really the initial part of being in the care home was about that wraparound care whilst allowing her to be part of a community.
And you spoke about her having a below-knee amputation.
Yeah.
Did she get a prosthetic?
Not initially. She was not initially deemed to be worthy of it. So once she was in the care home, I think when she tried the rehab initially, I think her mood had been really low, and I think losing her leg for somebody that had been really quite independent and used to being on the go was really difficult for her. And I think she'd found it really painful and hadn't initially engaged well with rehab. But once she was within the care home had embraced something called CAPA, which was a care inspector initiative about being active. So they had a bit of a campaign in her name. And
what was it called?
Her name's Leg. So,
Well done. Well done.
So with that, it almost became a bit of a campaign within the care home to get her back to physio, to get her mood, and realising being part of the community was actually enhancing her mood. So with that, she got back to physio, was engaging with that, and she then was given a false leg, which really helped her mood and her sense of self, because it gave her a complete 2 set of legs again. So that kind of filled the gap in her trousers. So when she was going out socialising, she was part of that. But just to note, I suppose, with my mum dying, that leg is a new life in Africa. And I'm sure my mum would have approved of that in terms of, yeah.
You said that the prosthetic helped, not just in terms of mobility, but when she was going out with friends and so on.
Yeah, just to give her that sense of self, because I think in terms of it just gave her that kind of complete look in terms of having her 2 legs. And I think it was still really important for her to be part of that community and still going out for her cups of tea and on the quest for the perfect strawberry tart.
Was that her?
Well, I could give you some recommendations of bakers. So,
tell me about visiting her in the care home prior to the pandemic.
Prior to the pandemic, it was very open and relaxed. There wasn't really any set timescales or restrictions set on that. How that would generally work, because I suppose I've had my social work career in Aberdeen and have a life in Aberdeen, which is like a 400-mile round trip to go. So the way that would work best is I would go down on a Saturday once a month, and then Easter holidays, summer holidays, Christmas holidays, and have longer then. But generally on a Saturday, that's when we would go shopping, out for lunch and have a whole day of it. Alongside that, her friends would visit as they wanted to. My uncle would visit generally twice a week, go in with the local paper, read the local paper with her, so they could kind of keep up to date with what was really happening community-wise. So there was no restrictions that impacted.
And when did you, lockdown happened in March 2020. Can I ask you, when did you last see your mum before lockdown?
So literally about the week before, because she had a hospital admission. That had been quite unusual for her, but her diabetes had been impacted. She had low blood sugar and she'd been in hospital overnight. So I'd gone down to visit just to make sure things were kind of back on an even keel. So I spent the day with her in the care home, had food with her. But I suppose then, obviously I didn't know what was going to happen next, and was just planning I'd be down for my next monthly visit, not knowing I was not going to see her again for months.
Now, you explained about the distance between where she lived and where you lived. Was there a close relative who lived close by?
Yes, I had an uncle who lived about a mile away from the care home, and he's the one who would go in with the Cumnock Chronicle and read the highlights of that to her.
That wouldn't take long.
But it wouldn't take long. But birth, deaths and marriages are very important for keeping up to date. And also, he would then go in generally on a Sunday as well.
Yeah.
So he'd be a regular visitor, and he would just kind of go in quite informally, and if there was anything responsible that needed done, he would have been able to go in to rectify that.
You also spoke about in the statement about that relative, if she became diabetically challenged, if I can put it that way. He had a particular mechanism for dealing with that.
So that was our fish supper. So what we found out, sorry, it's a bit food related this. So what we found, well, obviously a fish supper, because they're quite all consuming in terms of not just the taste, the whole smell and everything. So sometimes if my mum's wasn't eating well or needed prompted to eat, we actually found a fish supper delivery, and prompting with that was often a thing that would actually almost get her eating again and restore that balance and help maintain her diabetes.
You spoke about that as the emergency fish supper.
Yes.
I'm going to jump ahead now towards the end of your mum's life, although I'll come back to the emergency fish supper in a second. Did the emergency fish supper play a role towards the end of her life?
It did. I hope that would have rekindled something. So in the January 21, when I'd been afforded the essential visits, when my mum at that time hadn't really been eating, her diabetes wasn't really, they were really struggling to manage it in spite of the diabetic nurses' support. And the requested essential visit, initially I'd started with one essential visit in the January, and that's what I felt, given her new location in the care home and where it was, we'd try out the fish suppers and see if that rekindled her appetite again, or her engagement with food. And it did initially work, it did initially give that engagement, but what was observed, because I was only afforded initially the one essential visit, and for that to be face-to-face, they would see the difference on that night, and when that was happening, they would see the engagement, they would see her actually eating on that occasion, but it was only afforded on that one night, and then by the February it then went to 2 nights. From
your perspective, was it the low-fat diet of that night, or the fact that her daughter was there that made a difference? I think there was it was certainly because I was having the time alongside her, because there had been encouragement along with, because my mum by that point had really kind of given up. So it required lots of prompting to be efficient judges of the best fish and chips in Aberdeen, to say, you need another bit of that batter, you need another bit of that fish, oh, you need to try a combination with the chip to work out so we can score this properly. So staff wouldn't have had the time, but I think actually just having that whole conversation and engagement is actually what made the difference, and staff could see that, because they would see a lift in their spirits when I'd been, and they'd see a different engagement, they'd almost see a different side to my mum from that. Okay, I'm now going to go back to the first experience of emergency fish suppers, the point at which she's in the care home in the southeast of Scotland. And at that point, you went to see her just before lockdown happened. How did you find out lockdown was happening, apart from your professional experience?
So I think because I was living it every day, and then the care home phoned to say what was happening. Yeah, they just advised that the care home was closed. And then thereafter, trying to gain communication with the care home was really quite difficult because the lines were just frequently busy or engaged. Initially, the care home set up a Facebook page, which was new for them, and it would show, I suppose, at that time, some resident activity. But what you would do is, like, each day you almost log in just hoping you'd see your relative's face on Facebook, hoping I would see my mum, and trying to work out if that meant, does she look happy, what does she look like, or, you know, trying to take a lot from that picture, because that was really the only interaction I was then gaining.
Was there ever anything set up by way of iPads or anything like that?
Yeah, that came a bit later on, but that wasn't the best in terms of, because it wasn't, you didn't know when they were going to call, so it wasn't as if you'd go, oh, every Sunday at 2 o'clock this is happening. So it was quite sporadic and often relying on, she's a very good key worker, and I think a lot of the good communication relied on when her availability. But I appreciate they were really busy, so it would be quite sporadic. When I gained that contact, it was amazing in terms of, it was like so important just to have caught that glimpse of mum, because whilst with the iPad I could see her, but perhaps she couldn't see me. I'd be pretty much that voice, but she knew who I was, and my daughter could engage with that conversation as well when it was by an iPad. My 4-year-old daughter at that time.
4-year-old at that time?
Yeah.
And so was that the only contact at that time that she had with her gran?
Yes. Latterly in July, she was afforded the being on her dad's shoulders to look over a fence to see her gran. That was all that was allowed. Was
that to do with garden visits?
Yeah, that's when it went on to garden visits. But she wasn't allowed to be in the garden at that time.
At paragraph 37 of your witness statement, you make reference to a call that you received in May 2020. What was that call about?
That was advising on the Sunday night that a member of staff had COVID, and then that followed on the Tuesday to say that my mum had now tested positive. But I was aware from other relatives that other residents too had tested positive. And that's really, I suppose, when my mum really, I suppose, was placed in her room and then didn't really come out of her room until we were afforded the 20-minute visits in July, and then until we moved up the road to Aberdeen, she was in her room and in a shielding position, which I think my interpretation of that is really like almost like a solitary confinement, the way it was actually exercised by the care home's interpretation.
Right, well, you said care homes. Yeah. Is that your general experience, although you're not speaking in a professional capacity?
Yeah, I think in terms of that, was that particular care home's interpretation of it. There's across guidance from speaking to colleagues and from friends, there's been many interpretations of the whole range of guidance that was issued throughout the pandemic.
In terms of the isolation caused by lockdown, how did you cope?
How did I cope? So in terms of when Mum was isolated, I really struggled just wondering how she actually was, and because having my mum with COVID in a care home, but my daily living experience of contacting care homes and finding out people were dying, I was thinking, how is my mum really, and just having struggling to get through to the care home and been told that she's okay, but you're thinking, what does that okay really mean? Is she dying, not quite dying, or it was very difficult. And then I think in terms of knowing that my mum was isolated and just having sporadic contact, and when I was seeing her, I just felt that she was getting lost within herself.
Okay. You said when you were seeing her, was that because the good key worker,
Yeah.
what was she doing? Facebooking?
She was, she was either Facebooking, or she would send a photograph, because at that time they were still accepting parcels. So sometimes I would send down a parcel of like flowers or biscuits for the staff or whatever, and or a picture of my daughter's arms outstretched, giving her granny a cuddle, because that was the only way she could do that. They would take a photograph of that. My mum received it, and I would have a picture of my mum to know that she'd got the gift, and have an image of my mum. But I could see the deterioration in her.
Okay, the next thing which was introduced were window visits, and I want to ask you some detailed questions about window visits. Before I do that, can I just ask, how many window visits did you have with your mum?
Income, like 0, and for any relative 0. Within that particular care home, they weren't allowed. They said it was company policy. Even though my uncle was a mile away and would pass regularly, he wouldn't be allowed to visit a window visit. They didn't approve. They said it would be distressing for people, even though I felt that my mum would benefit from the comfort of knowing that my uncle was there.
So you were getting occasional or sometimes sporadic Facebook communication with her. What communication did she have with her brother?
None.
None?
No. The only time he saw her was in July 20, when I was then eventually afforded the 20-minute visits, and he could see over the fence, because he was behind the same fence where my daughter was on her dad's shoulders. And then when I moved, my mummy then saw her that day.
Now, I think there was I said I would ask you some questions about those visits. What I want to know is whether there was any flexibility in terms of who was doing the garden visits, or...
Oh, no. So I think when we move on from the window visits to the garden visits, which I think came in the July, initially the care home announced them, but then stated that I wouldn't be allowed to have a garden visit because my mum was shielding and she'd be remaining in a room. And I was like, no, I'll be seeing my mum. So that kind of prompted me to write to Jean Freeman, who was my mum's MSP, and also the health secretary at that time, to my own MSP, to the care inspector, and literally anybody that I felt that would listen, because I really felt that my mum couldn't be further discriminated and further isolated from her family. I wrote to Jean Freeman in July just saying, is this not a human rights issue in terms of my mum's ability to have that contact? Because I felt the way that the shielding was being utilised by the care home, where she literally was in her room. She wasn't out in the communal areas. Her social contact was really limited. It felt very much like a solitary confinement, and I could see her mental health being really damaged by that, and I felt there had to be a kind of a balance and a risk-assessed approach to this. It didn't make any sense to me. It seemed absurd. So after my series of complaints, to where I spoke, I suppose, with public health that covered East Ayrshire as well, because I couldn't understand the interpretation of that compared to my Aberdeen experience. The care home manager relented. She was very clear to say that she wasn't doing that. She felt as if I'd made trouble by doing that, where I was saying, I really just want to see my mum. This is not about... it's important Mum has this connection. It's important to maintain my mum's health that she's got this connection.
And when you started to have contact, how did that happen? What was it?
Oh, so in the July, because the agreement at that time, and it was interpreted, it was a 20-minute garden visit. And I was identified to the care home how impractical it was for me to travel a 400-mile round trip for 20 minutes. And they were like, well, that's the guidance. So with that, I did ask if I could alternate it with my uncle who was nearby. I was told that I wasn't allowed to alternate it. So after the complaint, they then allowed me to have 3 consecutive 20-minute visits when I was down visiting Ayrshire. So it allowed me not to go back and forward. So
20 minutes back to back or 20 minutes?
20 minutes one day, 20 minutes the next, but in the garden. So it was a bit of an absurd situation in terms of my mum was inside. There was a table between us, about a 6-foot table, patio doors, and my mum was wheeled to the end of it. I had on a mask and an apron, and I just had to shout across the table at her. My family weren't allowed in the garden. They were beside the garden fence and having to keek over. And that's how I had the first contact since March and the July. And when I saw my mum, I couldn't believe the deterioration in her. She just looked as if her spark had gone. She looked like a shell of a person in terms of there wasn't that interaction, there wasn't that.
And do you associate that with a physical deterioration in your mum or something else?
It's very much a mental deterioration, as if she'd kind of given up and not really understanding what was happening, because for my mum being a very social being and for that need for socialising, that need for conversation, that need for actually knowing what's going on in our community and our world had really been lost and disconnected.
So you've described particular features of your mum, and you've also described particular features of yourself, particularly in relation to the distance that you were away from your mum. Ultimately, that resulted in a change where they gave you the 3 visits back to back, as it were. But how difficult was that to negotiate?
Very difficult. It was after the series of complaints to the 2 MSPs, the Care Inspectorate, Public Health, to actually say this, to say, why can't you, I know there's guidance, can't you apply some human rights to this? Can't you apply some, not looking for special treatment, but just look about some common sense as well in terms of the importance and balance of my mum's health and well-being to how you're trying to apply the guidance.
In terms of that human rights approach, which we're doing, one of the things about human rights is that equal treatment doesn't mean the same treatment. That if different people are in different situations, then there might be a different response. Did you see any of that?
Not within the care home in Ayrshire.
No. And what was the reaction of the care home when you started to push back?
They weren't happy. So I think after the 3 days of having seen my mum, and each time at having seen how visibly changed she was, how withdrawn she was, I felt that I just couldn't allow this to continue. I just couldn't allow my mum to be subject to these conditions. So through discussion with my uncle, my mum's brother, I was like, I feel that I really do need to move her to Aberdeen. So when I mentioned this to the care home, in spite of me having power of attorney and my mum agreeing to this plan, they were like, you can't move her.
Okay, I'll come back to that. Let's try and unpack what you've said a little bit. You said you had a power of attorney.
That's right.
When did you get that?
So when mum moved into the care home, she signed for a power of attorney then, and she also arranged her funeral plan then as well.
And in terms of the power of attorney, who was the attorney?
Myself,
Right.
with my uncle as well.
And I'm not talking about right at the end of your mum's residence there, but during the period she was there, what impact did the fact that you have a power of attorney in relation to your mum have on the care at the care home?
So Generally, they were aware that the power of attorney existed. It was within their file. They had a copy of it, so it wasn't like a news sprung on them when I was mentioning it in July. But generally, that would have meant they would have consulted with me. I felt like a bit of a partner in our care, and decisions would be made together. So that's generally how it had previously operated.
And how did it operate now?
So in the July, it was very much trying to state that I wasn't allowed to do those things. It felt as if there had been a power shift, as if that I wasn't allowed to move my mum. And I was like, but I can.
And
that was
once you met pushback against the idea of you moving your mum to Aberdeen, what was their reaction?
They were saying that I couldn't. So I then felt that I needed to speak with the local social work department to say, can you please help me engage with the care home to explain my rights and the rights of a power of attorney.
So that's the the social work department in the area that you live in?
No, the area that my mum was in, sorry.
So, right, that was down in the southeast?
Yes. West.
West, sorry.
Coaster.
Sorry. Yeah. My geography's upside down. Okay. And what reaction did you get from them?
They were helpful, and they explained to the care home I had power of attorney, and if that was my mum's wish and my wish is power of attorney, they should support that. However, the care home manager, when I was on my third and final of the 20-minute visits, told me not to mention it in front of staff, which is pretty difficult because the garden visit was being supervised, staff were there. So, of course, I wasn't going to silence that. It was important for Mum's preparation that staff were aware of it, but I was being advised not to mention that.
And do you have any idea why they advised you not to mention that?
No idea.
No, that's fine. That's fine. So you had spoken to the social work department. The social work department spoke to the care home. Was there then agreement reached that you can move your mum to Aberdeen?
Sorry, could you repeat that again?
Yeah. So stage one is well, it's not stage one, but the first of the 3 stages is you speak to the social work department. The social work department then speak to the care home, and the care home then understand that you have the power to take your mum to Aberdeen. Physically, how did you do it?
By a wheelchair taxi, and then with my husband in the car alongside with my mum's luggage.
Right. Overall, what do you think the reaction of the care home was to you doing that?
They weren't happy. They didn't really feel as if it was something they could do. They felt that my mum belonged to them, and carers were like, you can't do that to her. I was like, but it's my mum. Do you know, it did really feel as if, like, whilst they're being protective of her, it's almost as if, like, their sense of that had shifted, and they weren't really understanding or respecting, I suppose, I was her family. And the importance and value of that in terms of how that was important to my mum and how that was important to her mental health.
I think you described that a moment ago as being a shift in power. Was that we have the power attitude something that was typical of your experience of the care home down there?
I suppose that's the only experience I had was of that one particular care home, yeah. But that hadn't been my experience until, I suppose, the pandemic. Up until then, we worked together. But that was really how they were operating at that time and how they were really using the guidance as a kind of a tool for that.
A tool? What kind of tool?
A tool that kind of felt as if that to exclude it and their interpretation of how to use it, how to use the guidance.
Would it be fair to say that they didn't like another interpretation?
Yes, I would agree.
We know that you decided, and in fact did, take your mum to Aberdeen. What contact did your mum have while she was in the care home with medical staff, doctors, CPNs? Start with doctors.
So when she was in the care home in Cumnock, so it would have been just quite regular contact as and when she required it, like she would get her prescription. There wasn't anything particular. At times, we had tried to involve the CPN when my mum had periods of confusion, but that had never really proceeded. She didn't really have an open relationship with the CPN, so it was just standard GP support treatment.
So what was the problem with engaging with the CPN?
They would often say that her infection was much more physical health based rather than mental health based. But she was on antidepressants when she moved to Aberdeen.
You have your statement there, yes? You have your witness statement there.
Yeah.
Can I take you to paragraph 74?
Yeah.
And you express an opinion in paragraph 74. Can you just read that?
Mum had gone into her room mid-May because that's when they started enforcing the shielding thing. It was really bizarre in a care home where most people would be shielders. You'd think they'd be safe together, given that nobody else was allowed in.
And then carry on, next paragraph.
I was physically shocked when I saw my mum at the July visits. Her physical appearance and her mental health appearance. She was just so inside herself. She'd checked out. I couldn't believe how frail and disengaged my mum was. She was a shell. Her face had caved in. Her clothes were hanging off her. She was like a shell with sunken cheeks.
How long had it been since you had previously seen her?
Well, face to face since the March, and then at other times it had just really been through the occasional iPad. But
And
I
how
suppose I hadn't
long
really got
with
the full
iPads?
sense.
How long since iPads?
Probably about a month or so. But I think when you actually see it much more face to face and gather it and get, I suppose, the whole picture in terms of with clothes and just seeing our mental health engagement with that, because I think sometimes when you're perhaps engaging somebody in conversation, you're not getting a bit. She was so just wheeled to the end of the table, and she was so enclosed within herself.
And then at 84, you describe something else. Can you go to 84?
Okay. I wrote a letter to Jean Freeman on the 6th of July 2020 to express my fear and frustration about recent guidance in regard to care home visits, lacking compassion and having little regard for the quality of life of residents. She did respond, but it was so bland. I think it must have been a standard letter. It didn't address my letter at all. It didn't take it point by point. It just said to refer to most of the policies at that time. It just directed me back to the guidance.
And then paragraph 86.
My local MSP, Alex Burnett, gave a much more personalised response. He did identify the Care Home Relative Scotland group and directed me to them. The group has been useful. It helped me feel that you're not isolated, that other people who have equally poor experiences, and you realise that you're not alone.
Have you found Care Home Relative Scotland something positive?
Yes, I think it was a safe place for expressing, I suppose, a sense of despair.
And were they also able to provide you with practical advice?
I think together we would share who could we write to, who could we lobby, who can we make aware of what's going on. Because surely if people know that they would want to do something different.
And then paragraph 91 through to 97. Can you just read those?
Yeah, I think because my profession, I knew the corrections to go to the local social work department. If I hadn't known, I'd probably just expected what the care home were saying. I would have thought, well, they must know better, they must be right, but they weren't, it wasn't true. I could use my power of attorney, and sorry, that's not a statement, but it's the context of it. When I spoke to the social worker about the power of attorney and being able to make decisions regarding moving mum's care homes, I did think mum had capacity, but alongside that, it was meeting her previous wishes.
You took your mum to Aberdeen,
Yeah,
and she went into a care home up there.
that's right.
Tell me about the selection process.
Of how I chose it.
Yeah.
Well, at that time, I was employed within the social work department, and one of my responsibilities was due to oversight, and Scottish Government had asked for an overview of all the care homes functioning within Aberdeen City. So between a colleague and I, we had to go and visit all 30 plus care homes within a 2-week period. So that gave a bit of an overview of it. Much as I knew the care homes, it was a bit of a whistle-stop tour of what was happening, how they were functioning. And then from there, I suppose I selected a care home in Torry, which is an area of the city, because for me, when I visited, it was the banter between the staff and the residents was really key. I actually felt in some ways it was a friendly environment where I felt my mum would be safe.
And you had the opportunity, fortunately, because of your professional experience, to make that judgment,
Yes.
that comparison.
Yes.
Okay. I understand that when your mum moved to Aberdeen into a care home, she continued to have window visits.
That's right. The window visits bizarrely seemed like a bonus in terms of moving to Aberdeen. So when she moved to Aberdeen, she had to isolate for a 2-week period. But there wasn't any limits to the window visits. They were, in terms of, and staff would actually enable them. So they would open the window and allow that. So it wasn't as if you could only appear whenever. Fortunately, my mum had a ground floor room. So when I appeared, they'd open the window, and visually I could see that my mum appeared more content. She was recognised me at the window, and my daughter could come along and shout in the window too.
And was that in contrast to what had happened in the southeast?
Yeah. It was a different experience.
West, sorry. Did you get the impression that the care staff in Aberdeen had a greater interest in your mum's well-being?
I don't know if I could really. They had a care plan in place, and we planned for a visit. And I suppose I'd hoped the opportunity of moving to Aberdeen, that my mum could become much more re-engaged, and I could perhaps get more of my mum back, because I really felt I'd lost a lot of her.
Did you still require to attend at a fixed time?
Yes, the window visits were unlimited, but there was garden visits which took place in a area of the garden that was covered. They were at a fixed time. I would be in PPE, and if my daughter was attending, you had to stand a certain distance apart, and they were supervised.
Can I ask you to read paragraph 118?
My mum really liked the outdoor visits. They were short-lived, given she would be brought out during her allotted time, but they were under a canopy, and you sat so many feet away. But my mum could see, and we could have a conversation, and it worked really well.
In paragraph 120, you talk about phone calls being answered in Aberdeen and being able to get through. That's a contrast with what had been the situation previously, is that correct?
It was. It felt much more effective in terms I could find out what was happening with my mum. And I really hope with the move as well there'd be that greater connection with her if there was any health needs that need to be addressed as well.
At one stage in Aberdeen, and I'm now looking at paragraph 121, you talk about your mum developing pressure sores.
Right.
And that being very upsetting for her.
So I think when we were outside in the visit, she would start crying. She'd start trying to tell me how sore her bottom was. And she would start crying, but I wasn't allowed to touch her. I wasn't allowed to comfort her. And I found that really distressing, because I think the most natural thing to do is when somebody's crying is to go and to touch and to reassure. But that wasn't allowed. And because the member of staff saying you're not allowed to go near, and I was like, okay, well, can you speak to my mum and can you reassure her? Because you're beside her, you're allowed to do that. I did actually write a complaint to the care home manager, because there was 2 instances where my mum was in tears. I wasn't allowed to comfort her, but equally the members of staff that were with her, they didn't comfort her either, and I found that really distressing.
At any point did you see in Aberdeen, did you see any of the care home staff comforting your mother in the way that you describe?
Yes, it was on those 2 occasions if they didn't do it, and it was felt that needed to be addressed in terms of it was really important that if somebody's upset that you'd deal with it. So sometimes I'd be observing when I was in a window visit, I would see some really compassionate care, and them begin to understand a bit more who my mum was and what her needs were.
So in your private life, as it were, you weren't able to give your mum a cuddle, but in your professional life, you were able to visit 30 care homes.
Which is really difficult, because I could see so many other people's mums and chat to them, see them, sit alongside them, but I wasn't allowed to do that with my own mum, which really kind of plays a lot in your head. It doesn't seem right or just.
Paragraph 125, you talk about breaking the rules. Tell me about that.
That was having an illegal cuddle, because I think, which sounds really absurd, but I think maybe at that time you were maybe allowed to touch a hand but not to have a cuddle, which is just. But I was aware that in terms of the member of staff, if she probably had reported that she would have got into trouble as well.
And you then, in the next section of your witness statement, describe in some detail the difficulties of not being able to have physical contact. I'm looking down towards 130, so from where we were to 130. Is there anything you want to add or expand on in that section?
So it was really difficult. So because my mum had been was in pain with the bed sores, I was allowed 2 room visits in December. And that was amazing. I wasn't allowed to touch anything, and they were supervised, and I just would sit in the chair and only be allowed to hold hands. And that's when I had a cuddle then. So I felt as if I had, like, oh my goodness, I've been allowed to see her. But then because she improved, and that then stopped, and I was back to having it more restricted. But then it was December, and with Christmas time, they said they couldn't allow face-to-face visits at Christmas time. And my mum's early January birthday, that wasn't allowed to be a face-to-face, because I think trying to give staff a break and manage rotas, they felt it would be unfair, because they felt that all families would want Christmas Day. So then again, it went back to a window visit and take my daughter along with a step ladder to open presents via a window visit. Yeah, sorry.
Tell me about that.
She's only small. So, so because she was 4, in terms of trying to have, so she could have eye contact with my mum would take a step ladder in the car so she could actually see my mum and shout in and speak to her. So Christmas Day that year was really my daughter on a step ladder, and inside the staff helped my mum open her presents so we could have some sort of family Christmas. But it makes for the most bizarre and strange pictures when you can't cuddle and touch the person that you really care about.
Mm-hmm. You spoke about Christmas. There had been an earlier party. I'm looking at paragraph 138. There had been an earlier party in the care home. Tell me about that.
Yeah, that was, so in this care home as well, they equally had a Facebook page where you would look out for your loved one or find out what was happening. But I suppose at Halloween in the October, I noticed there'd been a Halloween party, but it seemed to be the staff were there, but they weren't wearing masks. And I was like, this is wild, given I'm not allowed to see my mum. I'm only allowed 20 minutes. And it's so supervised, but yet there's staff going around without mask dress for Halloween. So I again raised that with the manager, and the pictures were removed from the Facebook page.
I'm jumping ahead now to paragraph 157. And at this point, your mum's health is deteriorating. Again, tell me about that.
So that's when I get the essential visits. But I suppose the build up to that was my mum had her diabetes was getting more and more difficult to manage, and I suppose was increasingly going on window visits or being called by staff to have telephone calls with my mum to prompt her to eat, because they would see the difference that I actually made, because I could prompt and encourage her through, I suppose, having the relationship with her and get her to eat, which would actually help manage her blood sugar, help manage her health. So I suppose there was a whole kind of lead up to it in terms of, I suppose in the November there was the whole obscure where the staff wanted me there. My mum I went and purchased food for her. She then had a plate of it. I was standing on one side of the window just begging and encouraging my mum to eat, and thinking, how can this be right? How can this be okay? So as my mum's health deteriorated, and I suppose I identified in some ways like feeling like the Christmas had passed. That was going to be my mum's last Christmas. That was potentially her last birthday, but not being allowed that contact, not being allowed to touch her, just to see her through glass, see her through a window. So I asked if I could be afforded an essential visit, because I think by definition at that time there was essential visits in place which would afford you to go into the care home. So initially I was allowed in on a Sunday night to help really with the tea time routine for helping my mum to eat and to be prompt on her medication, and that was seemed to have real benefits.
You spoke earlier about the emergency fish supper, but that was part of the care that you were providing. Other people were involved in that. It was diabetic, so presumably her GP was involved. Was there a dietitian?
Yeah, well, that's a bit of another story. So there should have been a dietitian, because my mum was really reduced in weight, and I think what really came out at our care review was from the time of admission till her death, she'd lost over 3 stones, gone from 9 stone to just over 6 stone. And you could really see that visually and the impact on her. So yeah, a referral had been made to the dietitian, but it got lost. And then the second one, it took some time to proceed once they worked out the first one was lost. But what I really felt was happening was the dietitian was given advice, but equally the diabetes nurse was given advice, and sometimes that would be counter advice. I didn't really feel her healthcare needs were very joined up.
And what about the GP? Were they involved in that?
Yeah, the GP didn't really have any face-to-face contact until I suppose, till she was admitted to hospital in the April. There was also a CPN involved, but she didn't have any visual contact with my mum until months after my mum had been in Aberdeen. I think I'd said that my mum had moved up to Aberdeen on a prescription of antidepressants. That continued in Aberdeen, and when her mood, I suppose, really dipped, I suppose, really from the November 20, there were changes to her medication, and that was really done with the CPN and the care home staff, and with them advising what the changes were. So there'd be tweaks and changes and additions made, but not really with the CPA and reviewing the impact, I'd ask my mum, how do you feel? Which is a bit key that you might ask your patient.
I have a couple of questions arising from that. At this point, you've still got a power of attorney.
Yeah.
Is that correct? Yeah. Can I take you to paragraph 166?
Yeah. So nobody was looking holistically. Nobody was looking at the whole picture. Everybody had a strand, and each time they would respond reactively. I felt we need to sit down as a group and actually make a plan together.
Did that ever happen?
Oh, yeah, eventually, by the April. But my mum died late April.
Do you think it might have made a difference if it had happened earlier?
I think if it had happened earlier, I think it could have been much more coordinated. It could have, particularly in regard to her mood. I think her mood was so key on her eating, and her eating was so key in her well-being. I think it was all interlinked, and I think to look at them separately was not beneficial to my mum's health.
Paragraph 173, you refer to a medical mishap.
Yeah.
Do you want to tell us about that?
Yeah, that was in January. One of the nurses gave my mum a double dose of insulin, which obviously could have been fatal. So with that, that resulted in an adult protection investigation. What we learned is the nurse hadn't looked at the MAR chart when she came on shift, and
MAR?
she just, the medication, I don't know what it is. Medication administration record.
Yeah.
So when she's on shift, she hadn't read that. She just automatic pilot knows my mum's at a certain time for insulin, and she gave it to her without looking, and it had already been given. So then that led to linking in with the NHS out-of-hours service to monitor my mum's reaction. But the only benefit that came out of it was it allowed me to get into the care home, to actually be with my mum and actually to work out what happened around the clock. And to just...
Sorry, on you go.
Yeah.
You tried to remember about your mum's weight loss. Can I take you to the end of paragraph 179?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
You give numbers there.
That's right. So, and that's from our care plan review, which happened on the 9th of April. So in terms of on admission, she was 9.8 stone to then be weighing 6.7 stone in March. So kind of lost a 3.1 stone.
Yeah.
So that was really noticeable visibly in terms of her clothes, in terms of her face, in terms of her... I was just watching my mum visually shrink and disappear.
Paragraph 184 in the witness statement. Do you want a moment?
Yeah.
Have some water. It's not up to me to make any decisions, but you've done really well.
Okay.
184.
Yeah.
I'll read that.
Okay.
On the Sunday before my mum died, the 19th of April 2021, I was visiting my mum at the home, and she seemed really confused. She had an infection. I think it was a urinary tract infection. I did advise staff at the time. I thought my mum had a further infection, and asked they would keep me informed if they got the GP and what the GP said. They phoned me the following day to say they had phoned the GP and were waiting for feedback. They asked me to come in. It seemed that my mum was getting worse, was more confused and wasn't responding. She wasn't speaking anymore. Your mum then died.
Yeah, she then went to the hospital and then died a couple of days after that.
Anything to say about the transfer to the hospital?
It was a farce.
Tell me about the farce.
So, in terms of giving this as a kind of my mum is by this time now unresponsive. The GP phoned for an ambulance because she was unresponsive. So the GP then left and said, if the ambulance isn't here in an hour, get the care home to follow up and prompt it. So when an hour had passed, the ambulance wasn't there, and I said to the care home, and they're like, oh no, we don't do that. And I was like, oh yes, we do. The GP said to do that. So whilst we're debating who's going to phone, the ambulance turns up. However, the care home in their wisdom felt that was a good time to show a student nurse what to do when somebody goes to hospital. So with that, they felt that the student nurse should then take my mum's stats, like her vital statistics, take blood. But I was really concerned that was delaying the time of her getting to the hospital. And that's not really when you should be doing that. It was a crisis. It was a 999 ambulance. It's not really the time for doing that. I later wrote a letter of complaint to the care home about the management of that.
But she was taken to the hospital.
Yeah.
Did the hospital maintain contact with you?
Yeah. So they phoned about 10 o'clock that night because I wasn't allowed in. My mum was unresponsive and I was saying, can I be there? Can I speak for my mum? Can I give you her medical history? Can I explain who she is? They're like, no, we'll phone you later. So she'd gone in about kind of 4 o'clock, kind of before tea times. They phoned at 10 o'clock and they said they were processing her and they had a few questions about diabetes. I'd explained what she'd been like on the Sunday because she had been speaking then, but I felt like she was now quite unresponsive and that wasn't like my mum. The registrar, when they phoned, said they weren't sure if she'd make it through the night. So I stayed awake, just waiting to hear anything. They didn't phone. I phoned to find out that they were actually going to be transferring.
Sorry, who phoned who?
Sorry, I phoned the hospital.
You phoned the hospital?
Because they hadn't phoned me. Because I was waiting, thinking I was going to get a call saying my mum had now passed, but that didn't transpire. So I was like, wanted to know how my mum was. I wanted to know if I could see her. So there was many calls back and forth. They were going to then transfer her to a ward, and I asked if I could get a pass to come in. And the nurse said she'd ask if I could, but then didn't phone back. So it took several calls through in the day to then establish that I could get a pass to get into the ward. And with that, they'd put my mum on a end-of-life management plan.
Did you see her?
Yeah, well, I moved into the ward. So I think using the opportunity of now having passed the ward, I managed to get a mattress and just slept alongside her. So
When were you in?
It was a Wednesday. My mum passed on the Sunday night. So a good few days in hospital. But I felt that afforded me the opportunity to give her all those cuddles that I hadn't been allowed to give before. Sorry.
Did you make up for it?
Sorry.
When you were in the room?
Yeah.
Did you make up for it?
Yeah, completely. That I made up for that time. But I just been allowed to cuddle my mum, been allowed to speak to her freely, play the music that she would have enjoyed, and just give her that bit of comfort that she hadn't been allowed for the last few months of her life.
And did you get comfort from that as well?
I did. I did.
In your statement at paragraph 206, you say that you feel guilty about moving your mum up to Aberdeen.
I really hoped it would be an improved situation. I really hoped that I would have got improved access and maybe have got much more of my mum back. I suppose I'm not naive enough to think that my mum was going to live forever, but I really hoped that as time in Aberdeen we could have maybe repaired some of that damage from the shielding experience in Ayrshire, because I really think that really damaged her mental health.
And
But yeah.
so you're saying there that you feel guilt about moving to Aberdeen? What did she want?
She wanted to be with her family, she wanted to be in her community, and I suppose she wanted to be able to cuddle her granddaughter, and that was something we never ever got. Whilst I got all the cuddles in the hospital, it still was very much one visitor in the hospital.
Now, in the witness statement, I'll take you back to the witness statement just now. You talk about getting her belongings back and buttons to sew on her clothes and so on.
Yeah.
All of that will be read. We don't need to talk about that. Okay?
Yeah.
Unless there's anything you particularly want to
No,
say.
I think in some ways that was almost like a final straw for me. So what had happened when I got my mum's belongings back, I found them to be soiled or vandalised by having her room number written on her clothes. So I couldn't then pass them on to anybody. They were just destroyed in my eyes. When she'd moved into the care home, they'd asked that I buy buttons with her name on them, which I had done. And that's something that could have been done, and it would have made it less institutional and would have allowed me, I suppose, to have those final memories of my mum and her clothes. But I just felt in some ways during this time, the way people in care homes have been treated, it was quite institutional and quite regimented, and I just felt that was like a further thing that could have been avoided in terms of just putting her down. It just depersonalised her further.
Unlike her prosthetic leg.
Yes. Yeah.
Now, I think it said on your, well, what did it say on your mum's death certificate?
It was about her diabetes.
Sorry?
It was diabetes. She died due to her diabetes, and it also mentioned her amputation as well. However, I felt in some ways what had hastened her death was really her treatment and the impact of, I suppose, not being able to manage her diabetes, not being able to manage her well-being, not being able to manage her mental health, that loss of contact with her family. Because a 20-minute visit through glass, or a 20-minute visit in a garden, or a 20-minute visit inside is not enough to sustain a relationship.
You move on to suggest lessons to be learned. And they seem to focus on communication between the professionals involved and the important role that family play in the care of people in care homes.
Okay.
Is that correct?
I think families are key. And for many individuals, that's really a key part of their network, and they can't be shut up. They need their They need their family around them to support them, to be their voice, to advocate on their behalf, to be there to cuddle them.
You also say something about your hopes for the inquiry.
Yeah.
How has today been for you?
Sorry?
How has today been for you?
I feel as if I've had my voice heard. I've been able to tell my mum's story. I suppose I tried doing that during the pandemic, but didn't really feel listened to. It felt as if I was just kind of forced back into referring back to guidance, whereas I think today has allowed me to tell my mum's story.
We've listened to you. Thank you very much.
Very good. Thank you very much indeed, Ms McMillan.
Thank you.
Very grateful. Very good. Tuesday morning, I think.
Tuesday morning.
10 o'clock. Very good. Thank you.